From the wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska, this is Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier with your host, Robin Barefield. In a land full of peril and vicious animals, humans are the most dangerous predators of all.
Perhaps you heard about the NXIVM scandal when the police tracked down and arrested the cult leader Keith Raniere in Mexico. Soon, tales of sex trafficking, branding, and child pornography painted Raniere as an evil man. Like me, you probably shook your head and wondered how anyone could get drawn into a cult. From the outside looking in, cults always seem crazy. I didn't pay much attention to the news about NXIVM. I did not want to read more about evil in our world. Then, a friend sent me a news story about an Alaska woman who disappeared after attending a NXIVM Executive Success Program class in Anchorage. When Kristin Snyder repeatedly blurted out that she was pregnant with Keith Raniere's child, NXIVM officials dragged her out of the class, and she was never seen again. I suddenly wanted to know what happened to Kristin, more about NXIVM, and why successful, intelligent women flock to Raniere to be close to him. Raniere is an average-looking man who denigrates women and believes their purpose is to serve him. This is the story about NXIVM and the disappearance of Kristin Snyder. Welcome to Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier. I'm your host, Robin Barefield, and I'm broadcasting to you from the heart of the Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge on Kodiak Island in Alaska. Keith Raniere was born in 1960. He possessed extreme self-confidence from an early age and felt he was superior to everyone else. Even at 13, young girls flocked to him, craving his attention. Raniere had the perfect personality to become a cult leader. Keith Raniere and Nancy Salzman, a former psychiatric nurse and consultant, created the business Executive Success Programs in 1998. They described Executive Success Programs as a self-help, multi-level marketing company. The company offered a range of techniques through classes and seminars aimed at self-improvement. It was based in Albany, New York. A few years after they launched Executive Success Programs, Raniere and Salzman rebranded the company with the name NXIVM. In its brochure, NXIVM described itself as a community guided by humanitarian principles that seek to empower people and answer important questions about what it means to be human. Over the next several years, 16,000 people enrolled in NXIVM courses. Most enrolled in its Executive Success Program, a series of workshops designed to actualize the human potential. These courses cost up to $7,500 each. NXIVM offered its Executive Success Program in several U.S. states, including Alaska. NXIVM was not a self-sustaining business, at least not at the level Raniere craved. Instead of patiently growing the company from the ground up, Raniere sought to bring in wealthy investors. In 2002, Raniere and Salzman recruited Sarah and Claire Bronfman, heirs to the multi-billion-dollar Seagram's fortune. The Bronfman sisters convinced their father to take an executive success class, and he was not impressed. In a 2003 Forbes article, Edgar Bronfman Sr. said he thought NXIVM was a cult. Sarah and Claire felt betrayed by their father's statement and began pouring more than $100 million into NXIVM. In the 2003 Forbes article, Raniere was featured on the cover, cloaked in shadows with the wording, "The World's Strangest Executive Coach." The article by Michael Friedman was titled, "Cult of Personality." Everyone at NXIVM was stunned by the piece. They had agreed to talk to Friedman and looked forward to a positive article about their company. Friedman questioned whether NXIVM was a pyramid scheme. In 2012, the Times-Union, a newspaper that serves upstate New York, including Albany, ran an article questioning NXIVM's motives. The article stated, "Some experts say Keith Raniere, the guru behind the unusual training business, is a cult leader." According to the report, Raniere was called Vanguard within the group, and a circle of women tended to him, paid his bills, and satisfied his sexual needs. A cult expert told the newspaper that NXIVM was one of the most extreme groups he had ever dealt with, in the sense of how tightly wound it was around the leader, Keith Raniere. On October 2017, the New York Times published an article alleging that Raniere's inner circle of women were his sex slaves, and they all bore a brand with his initials. In the article, a former NXIVM member, Sarah Edmondson, provided the reporter with details of her experience with the organization. According to Edmondson, Laura Salzman, the daughter of co-founder Nancy Salzman, recruited her into a secret organization within NXIVM in the mid-2000s. Before joining the inner circle, Edmondson had to turn over damaging information about herself so that NXIVM leaders could hold it as collateral. The name of the inner circle was Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which translates from Latin as Lord over the obedient female companions. The group called itself DOS for short. Edmondson showed the Times reporter a scar of a brand bearing the initials of Keith Raniere. She said that every woman in the group was required to get this brand. 2 months after the Times released its article, the Justice Department opened an investigation into NXIVM. Raniere immediately fled the country. On March 26, 2018, he was arrested in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. Prosecutors charged him with sex trafficking conspiracy, and forced labor conspiracy. Raniere pleaded not guilty on all charges. According to the prosecutors, Raniere created a secret society of women whom he had sex with and branded with his initials, coercing them with the threat of releasing their highly personal information and taking their assets. Raniere reportedly had over 50 sex slaves. Along with Raniere, other DOS leaders were arrested. Actress Allison Mack was also charged with sex trafficking conspiracy, and forced labor. Through a plea agreement, Mack was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Prosecutors charged Seagram's heiress Claire Bronfman, NXIVM co-founder Nancy Salzman, Nancy's daughter Lauren Salzman, and Kathy Russell with racketeering conspiracy. The indictment accused the women of identity theft, harboring aliens for financial gain, extortion, forced labor, sex trafficking, money laundering, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. The women all pleaded guilty, and Lauren admitted to keeping a personal slave locked in her home for 2 years. The judge sentenced Claire Bronfman to 7 years in prison. Nancy Salzman received a 3.5-year jail sentence, and her daughter avoided prison. The judge sentenced her to time served, 5 years probation, and 300 hours of community service. Prosecutors next charged Raniere with possession of child pornography, and they alleged he'd had sex with a 15-year-old girl, who later became his sex slave. Raniere's trial began on May 7, 2019. By the time he went to trial, he was charged with a long list of crimes, including racketeering, extortion, sexual exploitation of a child, and possession of child pornography. The assistant U.S. attorney who prosecuted the case described Raniere as a crime boss and predator who preyed on young women. The jury found Raniere guilty on all counts of the indictment. The judge sentenced Raniere to 120 years in prison. We will never know how many women's lives were ruined by Keith Raniere and NXIVM, but there is evidence that he may have been responsible for the deaths of 4 women. Frank Parlato, a former publicist for NXIVM, became an investigative journalist to expose Raniere for his crimes. He believes Raniere is guilty of multiple murders. A former NXIVM trainer, Susan Dones, secretly videotaped Raniere speaking to other high-ranking NXIVM officials. He said, "I've had people killed because of my beliefs, or because of their beliefs." Women who broke away from NXIVM feared for their lives because they knew what Raniere could do. Let me pause for a minute. I recently released the first volume of Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier. In the book, you can travel with me through space and time while I take a look at true crime in Alaska, from the gold rush days of the early 1900s to the present. Alaska has a reputation for independence and lawlessness. This reputation draws fine, strong newcomers who want to enjoy nature and pursue a wilderness lifestyle. Unfortunately, it also attracts misfits and criminals. In the early 20th century, Ed Krause boldly took what he wanted from his neighbors and then murdered them. With very little law enforcement present in Alaska in 1912, Krause and his gang felt they could do whatever they wanted. 60 years later, Robert Hansen kidnapped and murdered women in Anchorage over a period of 12 years before he was finally caught. The police and troopers were so overwhelmed by the influx of criminals into the area that Hansen flew under their radar for several years. Alaska has always had a high rate of violent crime. From the gold rush to the building of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the state's rich resources have attracted eager workers and criminals alike. Alaska also attracts misfits and wanderers. Some hope to turn their lives around by moving to Alaska, but they often bring their problems with them. Others think they will be less likely to get caught perpetrating their crimes in a state with sparse law enforcement. Michael Silka was a drifter with mental issues. We will never know what caused him to start his murder spree. Lewis Hastings was obviously unstable when he concocted his convoluted plan to destroy the pipeline, beginning with murdering his neighbors. Kirby Anthony had severe mental problems as well as substance abuse issues. He came to Alaska for a fresh start, but he could not control his violent tendencies. Grab a copy of Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier and read these stories and many others. What happened to Kristin Snyder? Was she pulled out of a NXIVM intensive course in Anchorage, Alaska, and murdered? Did she commit suicide because of the things Keith Raniere did to her? Or is Kristin alive and hiding from any remaining NXIVM enforcers who might be after her? Kristin Snyder disappeared on February 6, 2003. She was 35 years old. Before she vanished, friends say she was becoming increasingly depressed and confused. Her mind seemed to unravel. The sudden decline in her mental health is directly related to her involvement with NXIVM's Executive Success Program and Keith Raniere. Kristin was an environmental consultant in Anchorage. She was a respected business person and an avid kayaker. As an Anchorage Nordic Ski Patrol member, Kristin was qualified in survival training and avalanche rescue. She lived with her wife, Heidi Clifford. In November 2002, Kristin took a 16-day Executive Success Program intensive course. NXIVM co-founder Nancy Salzman instructed the course, and the sessions seemed to profoundly affect Kristin and her mental health. Kristin flew to South Carolina to visit her parents for Christmas, and they said she appeared angry and tearful, but claimed Keith Raniere was incredible. Kristin's parents questioned her about Raniere, but she refused to talk about him and immediately called her NXIVM coach. In January 2003, Kristin left her parents' house and traveled to Albany, New York. She wanted Raniere to mentor her, and he was excited about the opportunity. Raniere wished to experiment on gay women to see if his private mentoring would convert them to heterosexuals. Other women claimed Raniere did not wear a condom during his private mentoring sessions. After her mentoring sessions ended, Kristin returned to Anchorage, and her friends were shocked by her decline. Her wife, Heidi, said Kristin appeared sleep-deprived. Kristin told her that Raniere slept less than 2 hours a night, and she wanted to be like him. In truth, Raniere slept 8 hours during the day. One friend said Kristin appeared suicidal, and others thought she had a mental breakdown. Heidi said Kristin began to believe she was responsible for the explosion of the Space Shuttle Columbia, and she suddenly remembered that she had been sexually assaulted as a child. Kristin also began telling friends she was pregnant, and Keith Raniere was the father of her baby. Kristin and Heidi attended an Executive Success Program intensive in Anchorage in late January and early February 2003. Kristin was in no shape mentally to take such a course, and 10 days through the class, she seemed to unravel completely. On February 6th, Kristin disrupted the class several times by yelling that she was pregnant with Keith Raniere's child. The instructor, Esther Chiappone, told the other students to ignore Kristin because she was delusional. According to those giving the class, Kristin voluntarily left the course at 4 p.m. They claimed she waved at Heidi through a window as she walked away. Some of the students from the class, though, said Kristin did not voluntarily leave but was forcibly removed. Heidi asked if she could take Kristin to the hospital, but Chiappone said not to bring her to the hospital. No one giving the class was a skilled mental health professional, and no one tried to help her. At best, the instructor and other NXIVM members threw Kristin out on the street and refused to get her medical care. At worst, they abducted Kristin and possibly murdered her. Kristin did not drive her vehicle to the class on February 6th. So how did she get home to drive her truck to Resurrection Bay? Police have received no credible reports of anyone seeing Kristin after 4 p.m. on February 6, 2003. Raniere portrayed himself to his followers as a celibate monk. If one of his sexual partners got pregnant, he ordered them to have an abortion. If they refused, he threatened them. He ordered at least 8 abortions for women he had impregnated. If Kristin Snyder repeatedly yelled that she was pregnant with Raniere's child, those teaching the class would know they needed to silence her. Esther Chiappone was one of Raniere's lovers, so she knew Raniere was not celibate, but she also knew he would go to great lengths to hide his promiscuity. At 7 p.m. on February 6th, Heidi called the Anchorage Police Department to report Kristin missing. She explained to the police that she was concerned about Heidi because of her recent unstable behavior. She also called Heidi's friends in the Nordic Ski Patrol, and they immediately began searching for Kristin. The following evening, the searchers found Heidi's truck at Miller's Landing, a campground, fishing, and hiking resort in Seward on Resurrection Bay, 125 miles from Anchorage. The driver's door was unlocked with the key in the lock. 2 handwritten notes lay on the passenger seat. The first note read, "I attended a course called Executive Success Programs, aka NXIVM, based out of Anchorage, Alaska and Albany, New York. I was brainwashed, and my emotional center of the brain was killed or turned off. I still have feelings in my external skin, but my internal organs are rotting. Please contact my parents if you find me or this note. I am sorry, life. I didn't know I was already dead. May we persist into the future." The other note said, "No need to search for my body." The owner of Miller's Landing discovered that someone had broken into a storage shed containing kayaks and gear. The only thing missing was an old wooden and fiberglass kayak. The boat had no flotation and would sink if tipped. According to the owners, they had not used the kayak in 15 years. The Alaska State Troopers, Seward Area Fire EMS volunteers, the U.S. Coast Guard, Forest Service law enforcement, Civil Air Patrol, and Kristin's friends in the Nordic Ski Club began to search for Kristin or her body in the woods and on the shoreline near Seward. Keith Raniere sent private investigators from California to aid with the search. These investigators claimed to be ex-CIA operatives. Claire Bronfman wired $500,000 at Raniere's directive to cover the cost of these investigators. According to some in NXIVM, these individuals were conducting their own investigation. Law enforcement personnel believed they were looking for either a distraught woman or a suicide victim. They had no reason to assume Kristin had been murdered. Police found fresh footprints in the snow at a cabin near Miller's Landing. The cabin was shuttered for the winter, and the owner of Miller's Landing told the police the name of the woman who owned the cabin. When they contacted her in Anchorage, she admitted that she had attended the Executive Success Program with Kristin. Suddenly, she ended her phone interview with detectives and said she needed to talk to friends but would call them back soon. The detective thought her behavior seemed suspicious and found her association with Kristin an unlikely coincidence. She and Kristin took the same course, and after Kristin was ejected from the class, Kristin's truck with the suicide note was found near this woman's remote cabin. The detective wanted to bring the woman in for an in-depth interview, but those in charge of the investigation did not think it was necessary to talk to her further. Police investigators concluded that Kristin drove to Miller's Landing. Before dawn on February 7th, she paddled the old wooden kayak out into Resurrection Bay and then committed suicide by intentionally rolling the kayak and drowning in the freezing water. Some of Kristin's friends do not find this scenario likely. They said she was in no condition to drive 120 miles to Seward, break into a shed, steal a heavy 16-foot kayak, paddle out into the bay, and kill herself. Was Kristin kidnapped or murdered to keep her from saying Keith Raniere impregnated her? Some NXIVM members claimed Kristin faked her death to escape a drug ring. Keith Raniere said he saw photographs of Kristin and Heidi at the Grand Canyon several months after she faked her death. He never showed these photos to anyone, though. Frank Parlato, the investigative reporter who helped break the case about NXIVM to the police, has chased down numerous Kristin sightings over the years, but none have proved credible. Kristin's parents held a memorial service for her in March 2003. And in 2014, an Anchorage District Court jury determined the cause of her death was suicide. Parlato believes it is possible that Raniere had Kristin killed. He also thinks Raniere is responsible for the deaths of 3 other women and the attempted murder of another woman. Even if Kristin committed suicide, Raniere was accountable for her death. After his courses, and specifically after Kristin's mentoring, she became unhinged and seemed to plunge into mental illness. We will never know how many women's lives were ruined or ended by Keith Raniere. One survivor from his inner circle said she thought Keith's teachings would bring her closer to God, but she didn't realize she was walking with the devil. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you to my patrons for your support. Check out the show notes for more information on how you can support this podcast and unlock extra episodes by joining the Last Frontier Club. You can also search for this podcast on Patreon to learn more about the Last Frontier Club. I'll see you soon for the next episode of Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier.